In the last 2 centuries, our world has undergone profound changes that are for the most part little understood by the present generation. Only as humanity comes to understand the implications of what occurred during this period of history will it be able to meet the challenges that lie ahead. This documentary explores that turbulent period, focusing particularly on the last half of the 19th century and the amazing story of the awe-inspiring and charismatic figure, Baha'u'llah. Exiled from his native Persia and a prisoner of the Ottoman Empire for most of his adult life. During the period of his banishment to Adrianople in European Turkey, and later from the prison city of Akka in Palestine, then the Ottoman province of Syria, he revealed numerous tablets, unique in the annals of religion, summoning the reigning monarchs of the East and the West to recognize the day of God, and to acknowledge the one promised in the scriptures of the religions they themselves professed. He proclaimed unequivocally, "I am the one whom the tongue of Isaiah hath extolled, the one with whose name both the Torah and the Evangel were adorned. Blessed be the King whose sovereignty hath withheld him not from his sovereign, and who hath turned unto God with his heart. He verily is accounted of those that have attained unto that which God, the mighty, the all-wise, hath willed." In a time of shifting centers of political and military power, of autocratic rule, ethnic unrest, and violent revolution, of the rise of nationalism, and increasingly devastating wars of imperial expansion, Baha'u'llah, from his places of exile in the midst of these conflicts, revealed a vision of a global order intended to unite the religions, races, and nations of the world. "The tabernacle of unity hath been raised," he said. "Regard ye not one another as strangers. Ye are the fruits of one tree, and the leaves of one branch. We cherish the hope that the light of justice may shine upon the world and sanctify it from tyranny. If the rulers and kings of the earth, the symbols of the power of God, exalted be his glory, arise and resolve to dedicate themselves to whatever will promote the highest interests of the whole of humanity, the reign of justice will assuredly be established amongst the children of men, and the effulgence of its light will envelop the whole earth." In his momentous Surah of the Kings, Baha'u'llah directs his words to the entire company of the monarchs of his day, setting forth both the character of his mission and the standard of justice that must govern their rule. Subsequent tablets, including the challenging Surah of the Temple, originally revealed in Adrianople and later recast after his arrival in the prison city of Akka in 1868, incorporate messages addressed to individual potentates, including Pope Pius IX, Napoleon III, Tsar Alexander II, Queen Victoria, and Nasiruddin Shah. In the Kitab-i Aqdas, the Most Holy Book, revealed in Akka in 1873, Baha'u'llah enunciates the laws and ordinances of his faith, which he characterizes as the highest means for the maintenance of order in the world and the security of its peoples. And again, addresses the leaders of all religions, as well as the rulers of the Americas. Emperor Franz Joseph I, ruler of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and Kaiser Wilhelm I, emperor of a newly united Germany. This documentary places into historical context Baha'u'llah's uncompromising indictment of the conditions of human society, for which its leadership is held primarily responsible. Episodes at once moving and marvelous at various stages of his ministry are recounted, juxtaposed against the backdrop of an inattentive and indifferent world. All those in positions of authority are variously counseled, challenged, admonished, and warned, and the violent downfall of a few is explicitly prophesied. Characterizing this marvelous outpouring of revelation, which will continue to impact the moral, social, and political fabric of our world for the next millennium, Baha'u'llah himself declares, "Never, since the beginning of the world, hath the message been so openly proclaimed." In the second half of the 19th century, America was absorbed in exercising its manifest destiny, aggressively expanding its frontiers westward. The Mexican War, from 1846 to 1848, during the administration of James Polk, resulted in a decisive U.S. victory which forced Mexico to relinquish nearly half its national territory. Not counting Texas, which had been annexed by the United States prior to the war, the victory increased the area of the country by more than 60% and marked the beginning of the rise of the United States as a global military power. But there were hidden costs to this territorial expansion. The extension of slavery into the newly acquired territories became a major constitutional and political issue that led to the Civil War. Preoccupied with its own explosive growth and attendant political conflicts, and separated, as it was, by two oceans from Europe and Asia, America was only marginally involved in global politics, and then only when it came into conflict with the Monroe Doctrine and impinged upon what America believed to be its unique sphere of influence. A case in point was the ill-fated imperial venture of Napoleon III of France in Mexico, where in 1864 he supported the installation of Archduke Maximilian, son of Emperor Franz Joseph of Austria, as Emperor of Mexico. After the American Civil War, the United States supported the Mexican Republican opposition to this European adventure, which ended with France's withdrawal from Mexico and Emperor Maximilian's execution in 1867. The political dynamics of Europe balanced on the edge of order and chaos, revolution and reaction, war and peace, over the course of the 19th and 20th centuries. In 1815, at the Congress of Vienna, Europe managed to produce a tenuous balance of power. After Napoleon Bonaparte's defeat, the victorious European powers met in Vienna to establish a new European order for peace and stability. Under the leadership of Austria's Chancellor Prince Metternich, this treaty was meant to turn back the clock of history and restore as much of the pre-war order as possible. The positions of the ruling monarchs were to be strengthened, and liberal ideas, threatening to undermine them, were to be eradicated. Countervailing forces in this complex political dynamic included an evolving industrial revolution and burgeoning factory system, urbanization, surging population growth, and a growing educated middle class. These populations formed willing armies in the democratic cause. Their goal was to establish constitutional governments, which would give representation to the middle class and begin to address the concerns of the masses of peasants and workers who did not yet realize their own strength. These countervailing forces erupted in the revolutionary movements of 1848-1849 and threatened to upset the established autocratic order. There were a series of violent uprisings in countries where legal attempts at economic and political change had proven unsuccessful. The revolutions were initiated by members of the middle class and nobility who demanded constitutional and representative governments, and by workers and peasants who revolted against developing capitalist practices that were resulting in greater poverty. The revolutions of 1848 influenced the course of European politics in the long term by undermining the concept of absolute monarchy and establishing an impetus for liberal democracy and social justice. Despite the occurrence of the revolutionary upheavals in 1848, an uneasy peace prevailed until the Ottoman Empire had declined enough to become the target of the competing European nations, thus upsetting the balance of power. This so-called Eastern question instigated the Crimean War in 1854, which was followed by a period of clashes among the globe-spanning empires of Europe and set the stage for the First World War. Most of the upheavals and conflicts that began in Europe as it recovered from the Napoleonic Wars were attempts of ordinary men to rid themselves of governments that were repressive and socially unrepresentative. There was an upsurge of nationalism, accompanied by the related idea of imperialism, under which powerful nations rationalized the subjugation and exploitation of less developed countries. These two ideas ruled political thought throughout the 19th century, to the practical exclusion of any broader, global conception of a common human welfare. Underlying these pervasive ideologies were concerns with commercial interests, the search for natural resources to feed the Industrial Revolution, and developments in technology and military power to advance these interests beyond national borders. The masses of humankind, representing most of the Earth's inhabitants, were viewed essentially as objects to be exploited, civilized or mobilized as the shifting agendas of the Western colonial powers dictated. America was not immune to these pervasive and pernicious ideologies. After the Civil War, its official policies regarding the removal of Native Americans from their ancestral homelands to make room for white westward expansion was supported by the same notion of racial superiority, which sustained the institution of slavery. These racial and imperialistic policies continued in America into the 20th century in the Pacific, during the presidencies of Theodore Roosevelt and William Howard Taft, policies that are fully documented in James Bradley's recent book, The Imperial Cruise. In the summer of 1905, Roosevelt dispatched the largest diplomatic mission in American history, led by then Secretary of War, William Howard Taft. During this trip, Taft negotiated a series of secret and wholly unconstitutional agreements that would lay the groundwork for America's Pacific engagement. These invisible treaties, brokered with a small minority of Asians that Roosevelt deemed civilized by virtue of their adoption of Western ways, would lead to World War II in the Pacific, the triumph of communism in China, the Korean War, and the death of tens of millions in a matter of decades. These ideas of nationalism, imperialism, and racism, which ran counter to the spirit of oneness and unity articulated by Baha'u'llah at the end of the 19th century, could not help but adversely affect international stability and world security, that the machines of war were every day making more imperative. The danger of pursuing these policies, unfortunately, was not realized until it was too late. After the revolutionary failures of 1848, the so-called game of the great powers continued until it resulted in the tragedy of the First World War. Leaders of the 19th and early 20th centuries seemed to be free to make war or conquer territory at will. But in fact, none of the European monarchies or emerging powers of the period were free agents. They were all entangled in a complex web of relationships they could neither understand nor control. All the diplomatic posturing and scheming, all the intrigue and bloodshed of those years might very well have been avoided had political decision-makers recognized the organic oneness of mankind. Whatever arrangements they made, consciously or unconsciously, that were in accordance with this principle, and with the natural political aspirations of common men everywhere, and were supportive of social justice and democratic institutions, those arrangements tended to prevail. But whatever they did contrary to those principles led to terrible human suffering and planted the seeds for future, unimaginably horrible and devastating world wars. In this milieu of industrial and technological revolution, expanding means of communication, burgeoning commercial interests, social unrest, autocratic reaction, nationalist fervor, and imperialist expansion, a profound spiritual revolution was taking place in Persia and the Middle East, the common birthplace of the world's great religions. Shortly before the social upheavals of 1848 spread across Europe, millennialist movements within both Christianity and Islam were expecting the imminent advent of a new dispensation foretold in their respective scriptures. One of the most dramatic of these millennialist movements emerged in centers of religious study in Persia, and particularly the adjacent Ottoman province of Iraq, in the madrasas of the Atabad region, associated with the Shiite shrines of Najaf and Karbala, south of Baghdad. The movement focused on traditions which pointed to the imminent advent of the Khayyim, the promised one of Shia Islam. In the spring of 1844, a radiant young man from Shiraz, Persia, by the name of Sayyid Ali Muhammad, proclaimed that he was that promised one, the Bab, which in Persian means the gate. In addition to his own revelation, the Bab announced that he was the herald of a dispensation much greater than his own, soon to be inaugurated by one whom he referred to as He whom God shall make manifest, the universal messenger of God, awaited by all the peoples of the world. For a brief moment in time, it looked as though the entire nation would accept the Bab's teachings of social justice and spiritual regeneration. Persians of all classes were caught up in a storm of hope and excitement, aroused by the Bab's announcement that the day of God was at hand, and that humanity stood on the threshold of an era that would witness the restructuring of all aspects of life. "160 years after its dramatic inauguration in 1844, the Babi movement is now recognized as a remarkable event in the history of modern Iran, and is increasingly seen in its Baha'i resurrection as a relevant force in the modern world. This alternative narrative, still little known and understood today, advances a progressive discourse which is dramatically at odds with the dominant religious and cultural order of Shiite Iran and of normative Islam as a whole. It's a tradition that became active and potent in the mid-19th century when applied to the suppressed aspirations of the people of the Persianite world that stretches from Western China and Central Asia to Mesopotamia, the Caucasus, Anatolia, and beyond. This is a discourse essentially at odds not only with the Islamic Sharia and the Sharia-minded guardians of the status quo, but at odds with any regressive, backward-looking worldview. The intent of the Babi Baha'i movement was not to reform Islam, but to initiate a new prophetic cycle that aimed to bring to an end the Islamic epoch. No other movement arising within the precincts of Islam made such a clear and conscious break with it. The Bab's revelation, announced from within the precincts of an entrenched, corrupt, and fanatical system, convulsed the established order. The Ottoman authorities, the Persian government, and the Sunni and Shia ulama all conspired to blot out the nascent faith. The new movement constituted a real danger to the status quo at a time of growing social and economic hardships, moral decline, and the intrusion of Europe into the Middle East and Central Asia.